Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 6th episode of the History at Home series with Dr. Duane Vandenbusche. My name is Remy Schultz, and I am the Assistant Curator at the Crested Butte Museum. I would like to start the evening by giving a land acknowledgement. The museum recognizes that we are guests here on this land that is historically Ute territory. We acknowledge that the Uncompahgre Ute and the Tabewash Ute were forcibly removed from this area due to the Bruneau Treaty, and we hope that you will take the time to visit with our neighbor, the Ute Museum located in Montrose, Colorado, with exhibits developed in partnership with the Ute Tribes by History Colorado, our state historic society. While we can never do this history justice, we do include information about Paleo Indians of the Gunnison Valley, the Ute people, the Bruneau Treaty, and the Los Pinos Indian Agency in our exhibits. Other ways to support Indigenous peoples of today and the past is to go beyond land acknowledgements. So please consider taking steps towards allyship and reconciliation by conducting your own research of Indigenous groups that were forcibly removed from your own community, visiting local Indigenous museums and cultural centers, and reading literature from Indigenous writers. We hope that you will consider becoming members or making a donation to support this program and all the work we do at the museum. You can do that by visiting our website at crestedbuttemuseum.com or by calling us at the museum. This program is being recorded and will be available at crestedbuttemuseum.com and on our YouTube page located on the webpage. If you have any questions about our programming, visit crestedbuttemuseum.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok and sign up for our newsletter. We also always list our events in the newspaper. Thank you to our lead sponsor, Western Colorado University Foundation and Bill Petros. We will have time for questions at the end of the talk, so please post those in the chat box and not the Q&A. I'd like to wrap up my introduction with a big thank you to everyone tuning in tonight. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're back for more, thank you. As well as a thank you to our sponsors, Western Colorado University Alumni Relations and Bill Petros. That's you, Duane. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Remy. And thanks everybody for being on board. We got about 270 people on board, which is fantastic. This is session number 6 out of 11. Next session will be water, and that will be next week. And then the following week on October the 28th, Remy, keep the first picture up there while I'm talking.
Yep.
There you go, just keep it up there. And then in 2 weeks, I'm going to be talking with Pete Dunda right after this podcast tonight. And I hope that we will have the famous Pete Dunda and his polka group, which will be on the 28th. And I'll talk to Pete. We haven't figured out how we're going to do that, but we will get to do it. We'll also have questions and comments at the end. I want to thank all 3 of our sponsors, Western Alumni Association, Bill Petros, and Bud Bush of Bluebird Realty. And also, everybody knows I'm a great supporter of Western Colorado University, where I've been for a long time, and the Crested Butte Museum. And if anybody wants to donate anything in terms of scholarship money, go to crestedbuttemuseum.com for the museum. And if you want to donate to a scholarship to help a needy student, go to westernup.com. Remy, I want you to go to the first photo, not that one. That's the last one. All right, here we go, everybody. I'm going to talk about ranching in Colorado right now, and it's a great history that we had in the history of the West. So with the end of the Civil War in 1865, one of those great and colorful eras was about to begin. And this one, Remy, just go to number 1 that we were over. Sorry about that. There we go. We'll keep that on for a second. But this is one of the great eras in the history of the West and in Colorado. And that was the Cattle Kingdom, which lasted only 23 years. But it had a major impact not only on Colorado, but the United States. A man named John Dawson in 1859 trailed cows from Texas into Colorado. Very few of them, but he was the first guy to actually trail cows that distance. And in 1862, the great Texas cattleman Clyde Goodnight bought 200 cows into the Gunnison country looking for new range. The following spring, when he returned, all were dead because of a severe winter. Remy, you're getting way ahead of me. Just leave that first one on and don't put them on until we get to the next
Sorry,
number.
mouse malfunction.
Yep, sorry about that. When the Civil War ended, there was a great demand for beef. During the war, General U.S. Grant and Admiral David Farragut had blockaded the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, Mississippi. That cut Texas off from the south. No beef could be sent there, and Texas, of course, a Confederate state, was not going to send any beef to the north. This situation led to the buildup of 5 million cows in south central Texas, on the Nueces River and near a town called Bandera, with no market. Cows were worthless, or at best worth $1. When the war ended, these cows would be worth a lot of money if you could only get them to northern meatpacking centers. The origin of the range cattle industry is found with prospectors who brought oxen into the gold fields of Colorado in 1859. These Argonauts or miners turned oxen loose on the plains after arriving in Colorado. And instead of dying, the oxen did well on the native grasses, even during the winter months. And that educated people in the values of the prairie as cattle country. They shouldn't have been surprised. Millions of buffalo had survived for many years on the plains. Some now began to realize that cattle might be worth a lot more than mining. One man who saw the possibilities of cattle in the West was Illinois meat dealer Joseph Mccoy. Mccoy realized that if he could get trail cattle from Texas, where they were worth $1 or nothing, to a railhead in the Midwest, he could become rich. In 1866, he decided to try. No one knew if it was possible to go through Indian territory with herds of cattle. McCoy bought Texas cows for $2 to $3 apiece at best and headed them north on the first great cattle drive after the Civil War. His cattle drive ran from Bandera in south central Texas near the Nueces River all the way to Sedalia, Missouri, where the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad was, and there it connected into Chicago and the great meatpacking plant there. McCoy got $35 a head for his cows in Sedalia, and for the cows that made it, he made a tremendous profit from all of the cows that he had only paid $2 to $3 for. However, there were major problems with the Sedalia Trail. It ran through settled farm country. Electrical storms were common, and cows got lost in the Ouachita Mountains. 1866 would be the only time the trail was ever used. Railroads now were building west. The Transcontinental Union Pacific was built from Omaha to Sacramento in 1869, and that was followed by the Santa Fe. The Kansas Pacific, built from Kansas City to Denver by the early 1870s. All one had to do, and it would be tough, was to drive thousands of cows from Texas to a railhead in the Great Plains. And then the cows would be allowed to graze on the high prairie grass and fatten up. And then in the fall, be loaded onto railroad cars and sent to meatpacking centers like Chicago and Denver and St. Louis, Kansas City, or Omaha. Three great cattle trails ran north to south in central Texas. And there you get a good caricature of the Longhorns on the Chisholm Trail in 1871. The Western Cattle Trail ran from Bandera to Ogallala, Nebraska, and then into Wyoming up around Cheyenne. The famous Chisholm Trail that you're looking at right now ran from over to Dodge City from Bandera. And then the Goodnight Loving Trail ran all the way to Santa Rosa, New Mexico, and into Pueblo, Colorado. While Colorado's mountains were attracting gold and silver miners in the late 1860s and 70s, the eastern plains of Colorado Territory, Colorado won't become a state until 1876, were undergoing radical changes because of the cattle. Colorado was supremely capable of having a great cattle industry in both the eastern and western parts of the territory. There were four major differences between the eastern slope and the western slope with regard to cattle. The first one was altitude. In eastern Colorado, cows grazed from 3,300 feet to a little over 5,000. On the western slope, the average elevation was 7,400 feet, and many cows grazed up to 10,000 feet in elevation. Secondly was the presence of water. 80% of all water originated on the western slope. The eastern slope was a lot more arid. Thirdly, Colorado's eastern slope cattle industry developed faster because railroads got in there first, plus the great cattle drives from Texas made their way into eastern Colorado. They did not go through the mountains and onto the western slope. The western slope did not ship cattle out until 1882, when a Montrose rancher named William Boot shipped 2 loads out on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad to the Denver stockyards. The western slope was limited to valleys for grazing, but eastern Colorado was one big grazing area, the western extension of the Great Plains. 3 things had to happen before the range cattle industry began in Colorado. First, the Indians had to be removed, and they were, as the Cheyenne and the Arapaho were moved to Indian or Oklahoma territory in 1867 by the Treaty of Medicine Lodge. And the Ute Indians on the western slope were moved out to Utah in the year 1880. Secondly, the buffalo had to be exterminated. 13 million of them had once grazed on the Great Plains, but by 1890, only 10,000 were left, and they looked like they would go like the passenger pigeon, be exterminated. They were killed by buffalo hunters for their robes with the meat left to rot, and also killed by men shooting them for sport from traveling railroad cars. And the third thing that had to happen was that transportation had to come, and it did, from railroads building west from the Mississippi River and others internally within the state. Colorado got a series of railroads in the territory, and then later on after statehood, following the Civil War. They included the Denver Pacific, which ran from Denver to Cheyenne, Wyoming, tapping into the Union Pacific's transcontinental line there. The Kansas Pacific, which built to Denver from Kansas City. The Santa Fe, which came from Atchison, Kansas. The Colorado Central, which ran from Golden to the great mining towns up Clear Creek Canyon. And then, of course, the great narrow gauge Denver and Rio Grande and Denver South Park and Pacific, which got into western Colorado in the early 1880s. A great area of unclaimed grassland awaited cattle in eastern Colorado after the Civil War. And Colorado did have natural advantages prior to the coming of the cattle industry. It had a cool climate, free from humidity. It had great grasslands with gamma and buffalo grass, which survived frost and drought and kept its food value. It was located near the Texas cattle, which would be driven north. And finally, Colorado had railroads to drive the cattle to. Denver was destined to become one of the great meatpacking centers of the nation. Cattle had come to America with the Spanish in the same ships as horses, and they escaped into the wild at about the same time. Cattle became very big in Mexico, south of the range of the buffalo, and then spread north into Texas by the early 1800s. The Longhorns weren't much to look at, mostly bones and muscle. And there they are, being driven on one of the great cattle drives. And their meat was tough, but they could thrive on withered grass and shrub that would starve domestic breeds in the east. They could also roam many miles from water and find their way back. No predators daunted them, and they multiplied, and they multiplied, and they multiplied. By the beginning of the Civil War, millions made Texas their home. As cattle spread, so did the cattle culture. The Spanish had taught the Mexicans how to tend cattle. The Mexicans taught the Texans. The cowboy was first the vaquero. His hat was the sombrero. His rope the lariat. His leggings chaps. Many of the first cowboys in Texas were Mexicans. Not until gold mining began in Colorado did the cattle industry take off there. And then it flourished for 3 decades, 1860s to the late 1880s. And there is an original American cowboy, a Mexican vaquero in the 1830s out in California. The cattle industry left Colorado its philology, the folk spirit of a people, with its cowboys, cow towns, meat markets, longhorns, cattle sheep wars, railroads, language, music, and literature. Many realized early that cattle and fresh meat could be very profitable in mining camps, where thousands of miners had gathered. As I mentioned before, John Dawson in 1865 was the first to drive a small herd from Texas up into Colorado. As cattle were driven north on the great trails, prominent cattle towns began to appear on the ends of track of railroads. And there's a good shot of Dodge City. They had names like Abilene, Dodge City, Cheyenne, Julesburg, Ogallala, Pueblo, and Newton. Another early shot of Dodge City. Those towns are wide open with hotels, large cattle pens, railroad tracks, saloons, prostitutes, gambling, and shootings. Lawmen like Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and Wild Bill Hickok were brought in to try and keep order. Cattle raising in Colorado and the West involved much economic risk. There were branding expenses, Indian trouble, drought, disease, homesteaders, electrical storms which caused stampedes, and tough river crossings. The number one death of cowboys on the trail was drowning. And there you can see cows going across a river on one of the cattle drives. And it was drowning because none of the cowboys knew how to swim. And when they went across these full streams in March or April or early May of the year, if their horse went down and they went in, laden with all the stuff they had on and not knowing how to swim, they drowned. The cost of trailing a cow from Texas to Colorado was about $3 a head. The grass and the water along the way was free. Very early, branding was a haphazard business, but in 1872, Colorado Territory adopted a branding law, assigning each county a letter to go next to the personal brand, and all cows had to be registered, bringing a little order to what was going on. The average trailhead, which was run north, was 3,000 cows, with 1 cowboy for every 300. That meant 10 cowboys, and 3 to 6 horses for every cowboy. And now you know who did most of the work. The great Texas cattleman Clyde Goodnight. And there you look at him right there, portrayed in the movie Lonesome Dove, played by Tommy Lee Jones, recalled, and I'm quoting, "On the cattle drive, the outfit consisted of 16 to 18 men, each of whom had 3 to 6 good horses, a mess wagon drawn by 4 mules, which were driven by the cook, and a horse wrangler who had in charge of the horse herd. The best cowboys earned wages of $5 a day. They worked long hours. We broke camp at daylight," said Goodnight. "We were in the saddle until dark. It was a rough, hard, adventurous life, but not without its sunny side." Herds were started from Texas in March, and the drive lasted about 100 days. And there's a cowboy running the cows on a drive. And the drives finished in late June, with time for the cattle to become acclimated and gain weight before the winter. Most of the cows were allowed to fatten up on the prairie grass before being shipped to meatpacking centers by railroad in the fall. Soon, with water and feed free and cowboys inexpensive, big cattle barons or cattle kings came to be in Colorado. Cattle drives usually began at 7 in the morning, and the cows were allowed to graze at midday before being driven again around 1 o'clock. There is a cowboy in the winter storm, early winter storm, spring storm, I should say, with a calf that would have died without him, and he's taking that calf to the herd. It's a fantastic picture. The drive's finished in June. As I said, the cattle allowed now to gain weight before being shipped out. The drives usually lasted about 10 miles a day. Stampedes, the greatest and most feared danger of cowboys, along with river crossings and Indians, often slowed cattle drives to a halt, I should say. And there's a cowboy trying to stop a stampede. One of the great paintings of the legendary Western artist Frederick Remington shows an Indian bartering with a trail boss and holding one finger in the air, indicating the price for allowing cattle to move through Indian territory. And there's the great photo. One of the great cattle barons in Colorado was Sam Hartzell. Hartzell came to Colorado in 1860 as a gold miner, following the rush of the 59ers. There's a great shot of the blizzard of 71-72, Denver Public Library. Not finding a lot of gold, Sam Hartzell turned to buying discarded oxen and cattle left by oncoming miners. In 1864, he bought shorthorn cattle from the Midwest and had a great herd in South Park. He became rich selling to nearby mining camps like California Gulch, today's Leadville, Buckskin Joe, or Tarryall. Today, the town of Hartzell is located in South Park, near where the South and Middle Forks of the South Platte River come together on Highway 24 en route to Colorado Springs. The greatest of all the cattle barons was John W. Iliff, who came to Colorado to take part in the Great Pikes Peak Gold Rush. Like Hartzell, he wasn't much of a gold miner, but in 1861, he began to invest in cattle. When the Union Pacific Railroad reached the plains of Wyoming near Cheyenne, Iliff got the contract to supply beef to the construction crews, and he was on his way to becoming a great cattle king. He soon owned 15,000 cows and an additional 650,000 acres of open range that he controlled, from Greeley to Julesburg, along the South Platte River on either side. He had 35,000 cows on 9 different ranches, and he bought 15,000 Texas steers every year. He died early in 1878 at 48, but his wife continued the legacy. Today, the town of Iliff is on the South Platte River in northeastern Colorado, right along the South Platte, and the Iliff Theological Seminary still exists in Denver. John Wesley Prowers was another cattle baron. Got a county named for him in southeastern Colorado. Prowers had worked for the Bent brothers at their fort on the Santa Fe Trail. But in 1862, he purchased cows in Kansas, and he built up a huge herd. He furnished government forts like Fort Lyon and Fort Reynolds nearby with hay and shorthorn beef instead of stringy longhorns. By 1881, Prowers owned 40 miles of river frontage on the Arkansas River in southeastern Colorado, giving him control of 400,000 acres of rangeland, enough to graze 10,000 cows. James Jones was another Arkansas beef baron. He came to Colorado in 1879, much later than the other barons, but then preempted rangelands south of the Arkansas River. Today, Springfield in the southeastern part of the state would be his center. And he controlled enough land to graze 15,000 head of cattle, all branded with the famous JJ brand. Other big cattle barons were John L. Brush from Greeley on the South Platte River, town named for him up there today, and Fine Ernst, who ran 10,000 cows on the Republican River near Burlington. Great literature told of the great cattle frontier. Some of the great books included Andy Adams' The Log of a Cowboy, a day-to-day account of 100 days on the trail. Owen Wister, The Virginian. Charlie Siringo, A Texas Cowboy. Walter Clark, The Oxbow Incident. Zane Grey, 30,000 on the Hoof. And Louis L'Amour, The Black Canyon. Louis L'Amour was one of the biggest sellers of all time, any books, and wrote his books in room 221 and 222 of the Strater Hotel in Durango. And then there were the great movies about the cattle frontier, Red River, The Big Country, and Giant. By 1871, the Colorado Territorial Legislature set up a roundup law requiring each county to hold one every spring and fall. Later on, Stray Day came, involving cows that had strayed off their range or were unbranded. By the 1870s, investors had figured out that the cattle business was a great investment, and investors moved in with more money and cows. English and Eastern companies got involved with names like Swan and Prairie Land and Cattle. By the year 1884, 5.2 million cows had been trailed into Colorado and millions into the Great Plains states like Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, dangerously overstocking the range. There is a picture, it's kind of hard to see, but it's a guy trying to stop a stampede. Longhorns with their tough and stringy meat were gone, replaced by shorthorns and Herefords. Along with the rise of corporate ranchers came homesteaders into Colorado because of the 1862 Homestead Act. That act gave 160 acres of federal land to anybody in the West who was free, white, and 21. The only stipulation was that you had to pay a $34 registration fee and promise to live on and make improvements on the land for 5 years. If you didn't want to do that, you could buy it for $1.25 an acre or $200 for 160. The Homestead Act didn't work very well in the west of the Mississippi because of the lack of water available. One couldn't even raise one cow on the arid 160 acres. Little sidelight now. In 1922, a young professor named Walter Prescott Webb was hired at the University of Texas. And Webb read a book by Emerson Huff called The Way West, in which Huff said that the West had been settled by the axe, the boat, the rifle, and the horse. And Walter Prescott Webb said, it might have been settled by the rifle and the horse, but it sure as hell wasn't settled by the axe and the boat, because out on the Great Plains in eastern Colorado, there are no trees, and there certainly aren't any navigable streams. So Webb wrote one of the greatest works ever and called it The Great Plains, in which he basically said that anybody trying to use the same techniques of farming or ranching west of the Mississippi River that they had used east of the Mississippi River was doomed to failure, because the land was arid. The wind blew all the time. There was no timber, and the soil was harder than hell. Walter Prescott Webb and the famous Great Plains thesis. The Homestead Act caused a lot of trouble with ranchers who were used to having the open range for themselves. In the year 1874, a man named John F. Glidden invented barbed wire, which allowed homesteaders to fence in their 160 acres. That broke up cattle drives. Cattlemen rebelled and began to fence in great amounts of open range. Charlie Goodnight in New Mexico and southern Colorado fenced in 3 million acres of government land. In 1885, a federal law ordered the removal of all illegal fences and forbade any interference with homesteaders. The furious cattlemen referred to barbed wire as the devil's hat band. Cattlemen then went to Congress and proposed that the government forget about the Homestead Act from the 100th meridian to the Sierra Nevada mountains and allow 3,000 ranchers instead. That was voted down, but it probably was the right thing to do because the area was too arid for good farming. The ranchers then proposed a national cattle trail from the Red River to the Canadian border, 5 miles wide with federal bridges and railheads. This did not pass Congress because many Colorado ranchers greatly feared getting diseased cattle and overstocking the range. Colorado Stock Growers Association, formed in 1867 to protect cattle interests. It prosecuted cattle thieves, helped prevent overcrowding of the range, wiped out predators like coyotes and wolves, lobbied for good laws, opposed sheep, and paid for detectives to catch rustlers. And there was a great story of cattlemen up in northwestern Colorado around Craig and the Yampa River having a lot of rustling problems, and they hired an ex-sheriff and paid him $500 a month to track them down. 6 months went by, no rustler was captured. All the cattlemen called the sheriff in and said, "What's going on here? You haven't gotten anybody." And the sheriff said to them, "If I arrested everyone I knew who was guilty of rustling, all of you guys would be in jail." So a lot of the cattlemen were rustling from each other. They always said if you went to a neighbor's house and had a good steak, you never could be sure if you weren't eating your own steak. The first shipment of Western Slope cattle out of the area to the Denver cattle yards came in 1882, and they're the Denver cattle yards, when Montrose rancher William Booth shipped 2 cars of cows over Marshall Pass. By the 1880s, cattle was king in Colorado and the Great Plains. It was said that all one had to have in the plains or Colorado to be a cowboy was guts and a horse. And with guts, you could steal the horse. Another expression was one cattleman talking to another and saying, "This would make a nice country if there was a little better society and plenty of water." The other cattleman replied, "Yes, and a little better society and plenty of water would make hell a paradise." However, dark clouds were on the horizon at the peak of the cattle industry, and the great days of that kingdom began to fade by the mid-1880s. And by 1887, the great days were over. And the end came because of the following reasons. The big one was the overstocking and the overgrazing of the range. Too many cows on an arid land that led to disaster. And there you see a homesteader raising wheat, 160 acres of it. Secondly, involved the fencing in of the open range by homesteaders. That prevented even grazing and caused cows in winter blizzards to come up against barbed wire fences and freeze standing up. And then there were Colorado state quarantine laws. By 1886, the state had put inspection stations on the border to prevent diseased cattle with Texas tick fever or hoof and mouth disease from crossing into the state. And then the federal government enforced their laws involving quarantines, supporting the Homestead Act, tearing down fences on the open range, and forcing the obeyance of water laws and meat standards. The wide open days of the open range were over. But the final blow was the 2 tremendous back-to-back winters of 1885 and 6 and 1886 and 7. The wide open spaces were never the same after that second terrible winter. Lulled into a false sense of security by previous mild winters, the frigid lessons of 1886 and 7 were the toughest ever learned out west. The last of the great buffalo herds had disappeared by the mid-1870s, leaving the ranges open for the massive cattle drives. In 1884 alone, 500,000 cows had been driven out of Texas. Profits were enormous, and more cattle appeared on the arid range. In October of '86, snows fell in Colorado and the Great Plains in October, damming up streams. Grass froze under the ice just in time for a string of December blizzards. In January of '87, Colorado experienced inch-an-hour snow for 16 hours. The state was a great chunk of ice, preserved at a breath-stealing 46 degrees below zero. After 10 days of those temperatures, another 72-hour blizzard blew in. When the sun finally reappeared in late February, Cattleman Teddy Blue Abbott told of an old cowboy who stopped, looked up at the sun, and said seriously, "Where the hell was you last January?" Losses were enormous. 75% of all cows in Colorado and the Great Plains were dead. The herds had run against fences where they huddled until they froze to death. The winters had permanently changed Colorado in the West, and claimed as million as 5 million cows is long gone. Gone also are the greedy practices that caused the disaster. For many years after, though, there were old timers who kept the memory of those terrible winters alive every time snow clouds gathered, with memories that always began back in '86. There was one more thing that led to changes in the cattle industry in Colorado, and that was the introduction of sheep. Sheep had always been in the state, especially in the southern part, owned by Hispanic ranchers. In 1868, there were 305,000 sheep in Colorado. 18 years later, in 1886, because of the introduction of the fine wool merino sheep, there were over 2 million. Cattlemen fought back with force to drive the sheep out. They poisoned water holes, shot sheep herders, and killed sheep where they found them. The cattle sheep wars were most pronounced in the Gunnison country, when sheep were either bludgeoned to death in Taylor Park, driven off cliffs in O.B. Joyful north of Crested Butte, or killed at Iola. The conflict was also the scene of many killings in northwestern Colorado, where a man named John Rawl Burroughs wrote a great book, Where the Old West Stayed Young. Cattlemen always claimed that sheep cropped the grass so low to the ground that they caused erosion. And that's true unless you keep them moving. And also that they emitted a stinking substance from their hooves onto grass over which cattle would not graze. In reality, there were 2 real reasons for the cattle-sheep wars. One was racial. Cattlemen were Anglo and most sheepmen were Hispanic. But the second one was the big one, and that was economic. There was only so much range, and both sides wanted it. Prominent rancher Alonzo Hartman of Gunnison, when asked by a sheepman if he ever eaten mutton, replied, "Yes, but I am damned ashamed of it." With the cattle industry wiped out in eastern Colorado, the opposite occurred on the western slope. With lush valleys, plenty of water, the arrival of railroads, and a tremendous market for beef and booming mining camps, the western slope cattle industry boomed, and most ranchers got their start from around that time. In the Gunnison country in 1910, there were 300 ranches, 40,000 cows, 10,000 horses, 2,000 hogs, and tremendous irrigated hayfields. Other great cattle areas on the western slope included northwest Colorado along the Yampa River, the Uncompahgre Valley around Montrose and Delta, the Roaring Fork around Aspen, and the great area of Middle Park. Cattle is still a major industry in Colorado today, with ranchers able to get permits on Forest Service land for grazing. And there's a great shot of the Taylor Park cattle pool in the 1920s. And some of you folks in the Gunnison country will recognize those names: Collard and Blackstock and Vader and Stevens and others. In 1919, the great Western painter Charlie Russell addressed a stock growers meeting in Miles City, Montana, and declared, and I quote, "Cow folks are scarce now, but I am glad of a chance to meet the few that still live. Most of my old friends either rode for or owned irons. Many of them crossed the big range, but they left tracks in history that the farmer can't plow under. Good or bad, they were regular men and America's last frontiersmen. Today, ranchers in Colorado are all that stand in the way of development of some of the finest land in the state. Many have put their land in conservation easements. In reality, they are the best environmentalists we have because they take great care of the land. long live ranching. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it. And Remy's now going to come on and tell you how to answer the trivia question for a great book on around the Gunnison country. So
Okay.
Remy, fill them in.
Yep, so Duane will ask you our question there and you will answer in the chat box and not the Q&A box. And I'll go through whoever's first. I'll get that information out to Dr. Vandenbusche here.
It is first come, first served. So here we go. I want you to identify the great Texas cattleman portrayed in Lonesome Dove, who had one of the 3 cattle trails named for him and also looked at Gunnison County as a possible range. We await the answer. There's Keith Fulmer. Keith Fulmer, number 1 on the board.
I think
He gets it. Clyde Goodnight.
Vicky Fightmaster there.
Yeah, but Keith Fulmer was number 1. So we'll get Keith Fulmer. He answered number 1 on my screen. So we'll get Keith, we'll get your email a little later on. Are there any questions or comments that anybody has on the ranching industry in Colorado? There's a lot more there, of course, but you can only cover a certain amount in 45 minutes. But I'm happy to answer any questions or get any comments. So fill us in. Why did they make only 10 miles a day with cattle drives? Well, that's a lot of land to cover. And remember, they didn't drive them during the heat of the day. So they kind of ate as they walked. So 10 miles is really a lot of distance to cover in one day. Any other questions? Remy, you can see some of them too.
What is the current percent of ranching today?
You know, the current percent of ranching today is still a big industry. And if you're talking about how much land is in ranching, it's quite a bit with regard to permits. But in terms of actual ranchers, I don't have an answer to that, but it's probably around, 5 to 7%, about the same as farming. Any other questions or comments, folks? Don't be shy. Doug. I'll be darned. Rick Kreitzer, yeah. William Kreitzer, one of the great ones. Yeah, Carol, they did have ranching in the Crystal River Valley, you bet. All the way down to Carbondale and beyond. Any other questions or comments? When did they start haying in the valley? Well, initially in the 1880s, and I've got some photographs of some very early hay loaders and then some of the first hay balers. But they were cutting hay, irrigating hay meadows, and then cutting hay in the 1880s, you bet. Did a little differently than they do now, though. Would women also help drive the cattle? There may have been a few, but not many. They were usually taking care of the children and doing all of the hard work. To what extent are Hispanic workers important? Well, Mark, in the early days, a lot of the cowboys were Hispanic. They were the original cowboys, the vaquero. And, 1 in 8 cowboys was black. Probably 2 in 8 cowboys was Hispanic. So a lot, but I don't have the exact figures. Yeah, Dan Thornton, Kathy Wilkins. Dan was from Oklahoma. He married Jessie Thornton, who had the money. They came to Gunnison County in the late 1940s. They had some of the best bred cattle in the world at what today is North Elk Meadows, north of town. That was kind of the Thornton Ranch. And he sold out in a dispersal sale in 1949. And then when the Republican candidate for governor died unexpectedly in 1950, Dan Thornton was picked And he became the governor of Colorado from 50 to 52 and then 52 to 54. Yeah, Kathleen makes a great point. Kathleen Curry, thank you. Hispanic workers are absolutely critical to the ranching industry in the Gunnison country today, you bet. Yeah, Bill, there is a great film. It's called The American Cowboy, put out by the Ford Motor Company, and that is about Gus Roberson's ranch up Ohio Creek. We have it in our library, and if you get on Amazon or look it up, it's called The American Cowboy, put out by the Ford Company. Any other questions or comments, folks? Feel free to come into the chat box. You know, Darcy, you're right. When Minchner wrote Centennial, he wrote it about Greeley, but of course, when he wrote about cattle, John Iliff was one of the individuals that he covered, I think by a different name. It's a great book, incidentally, Centennial by James Minchner, Early Days of Colorado. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, green smooth brome can be converted into a rare steak. Yeah. What breed of horse did they ride? Well, all I know is they had quarter horses. Some of the cattlemen on board tonight can probably tell me. Refrigerated trains did not come in until the, I'm trying to think of this, the middle 1870s or the late 1870s. Before that, no refrigeration. Other questions or comments? It's great to have everybody on board. Next week, we're going to talk about the #1 item in Colorado. Oh, here's Rich and Phyllis. The Great American Cowboy is on YouTube as well. Thank you, Phyllis and Rich. And the #1 priority in Colorado history is water. And I can guarantee you everything we talked about pales in insignificance to water. And I also guarantee you that it'll be an exciting lecture. Water doesn't appear to be exciting, but this one will be next week. So we hope to have a lot of people on board. Any other questions or comments? You bet. Thank you. Thank you, Patty. Any other comments? Feel free to chip in. Yeah, Kathleen, thank you. I'll see you at 5:30. Thanks, Cindy. Good to have you on board. Say hi to Steve for me. Anybody else? Nikki, thank you.
I got one question on my end, Duane.
You bet.
It's what effect did cattle have on native grasses?
You know, the cattle, if you're talking about the open range out on the Great Plains, it was devastating because they overgrazed the range. But the cattle industry that we have now in Colorado, these people take great care of the land, and the hay that they turn out is fantastic. But during those days of the cattle kingdom, from the late 1860s to the middle 1880s, all that great grass on the prairie was just nubbed down to practically nothing because of overgrazing. Any other comments or questions, folks? Thank you, Martin. I appreciate it. Looking forward to talking to everybody next week. Keith Fulmer, make sure that you give Remy your physical address so she can give it to me and I can send you the book for answering first on Clyde Goodnight.
Here, Keith, I'll send my email in this chat and we can connect.
All right, folks, if there are no more questions, thank you, Tempe. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Barb. Appreciate the comments. Yep. Thank you, Ashley. Hope you're doing well at Marchitelli's tonight. Thank you, Jen. It was great to meet you over at Rumors yesterday. All right, everybody. This is Vandenbusche over and out. And I will see everybody next Thursday at 7 o'clock for water. Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Kimberly. Thanks, Carol. You know, Carol, the answer to that question is primarily economic. And sheep will crop the grass real low unless you keep them moving. And that's why they got the sheep herders that kept them moving. All right, everybody. See you next Thursday. Thanks a million. Remy, thanks a lot for a great job.
Thank you.
Over and out.